I'm just going to cut right to the chase. Here's the problem, okay? We've had decades of fire suppression in our forests for, well, to protect structures, lives, and landscapes. But, you know, it's unnatural to actually suppress fire in our forests because it eventually leads to the buildup of excess fuel, debris, and even disease in our forests. And it also then actually leaves them much more prone and vulnerable to high intensity, high temperature fire, and that's not a good thing. In a word, fire suppression is actually contributing to some unhealthiness in our forests. Now, I have here, as Carlton mentioned, some torrefied wood that can almost magically help solve this problem if we use it as a renewable fuel to displace coal in a coal-fired power plant. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this and the thesis behind it in particular during this talk. But before we do that, it's probably a good idea to look at some of the effects of these unhealthy forests. So what you see here is a picture of my hometown, Portland, Oregon. It's what passes for a beautiful sunny day in Portland. You're looking east, that's Mount Hood in the background. For those of you familiar with the Willamette Valley, you know we treasure these days because it's so overcast there due to how much rain we get. This is how it looked in the fire season of 2017. It looked like this because when a forest catches fire now, it burns hotter, it burns longer, it covers larger areas. And if there are any number of fires in the region, and that's been happening, these smoke plumes have been aggregating and distributing literally region-wide and penetrating even urban areas. Most of the West Coast actually looked like this during the fire seasons of 2017 and 2018, and they looked like this for literally weeks on end. You cannot see Mount Hood. This is the same vista, but you can certainly see what you're breathing, and that's not going to be healthy either. Fire is ecologically normal. Suppressing fire is not. This is actually a low temperature fire that is being conducted as a controlled burn in our dry inland forests in the West. It's actually being conducted under the auspices of the U.S. Forest Service, and the trees that you see here are ponderosa pine. They are ecologically adapted to these kinds of low temperature fires. They will survive it. They'll thrive in the aftermath. Very few trees will survive a fire like this. This is a ground temperature fire. It burns so hot in this fire because of having just so much there to burn. It actually rivals the temperature inside a power plant boiler. It's that hot. Temperatures this hot in a forest actually damage the forest ecosystem itself. It makes tree regeneration in the aftermath much harder, takes longer. The burnout is so complete, the soil is left bare for long periods of time. The next rainfall, you get erosion, muddy streams, rivers. Basically, there's no good news in a fire like this. If you are one of our agencies now that are tasked with caring for our public lands, you're actually tasked with two things now when it comes to fire. One is you want to continue to suppress fire to protect lives, landscapes, and structures. But you also now have to deal with that excess fuel that is building up as a function of that public policy. That's usually done in two ways. One is through that controlled burn that we just showed you, and the other is through the mechanical removal of the material out of the forest. Well, how big is the problem? You know, just within the boundaries of our national forest, we have 193 million acres. 80 million acres of that 193 have to be treated in order to reduce that excess fuel load or restore it in that respect. That's 1/2 the size of Texas, about 4% of the U.S. landmass in the lower 48. When you remove that excess fuel, either through a controlled burn or mechanical removal, you're essentially mimicking what nature would do if it was left unimpeded. This is a big problem. It's a lot of landscape to have to deal with. And the thesis of this talk is that, well, you know, big problems usually require big solutions. Big solutions usually require lots of money. And interestingly, lots of money can evolve if you attach some economic value to the objective that you're interested in or the outcome. Let me give you an example. In 1975, 1.5 million pet rocks were sold in the United States. $4 a rock. Hey, you know, for the folks who have a penchant for the absurd, right? A lot more seriously on the other end of the spectrum, and when I was growing up, you could actually see this, car and truck lead acid batteries had been routinely just tossed on the street or a stream bed or a ditch as a method of disposal. Now that doesn't happen anymore because there is a $5 to $18 per battery rebate to bring them back and get them taken care of correctly. The point here is that money talks, and the results can be pretty startling. You know, look, I've walked this earth for 67 years, and I will tell you that I was very surprised in 1975 that somebody would actually try and sell a rock to a fellow human being, okay? But I was absolutely astonished when I actually did the calculation. Over 0.5% of the population in 1975 would actually fork over real cash money to buy a rock. Now, it came with an interesting backstory. You got a certificate and it came in a cute box, but you know, it's still a rock. But you know, when it comes to lead acid batteries, and it's much more serious in that sense, just like pop cans and bottles, it is now one of the most, if not the most, recycled items on our shelf, and that's a good thing. So the question is, can we attach some economic value similar to these kind of extremes here to encourage the removal out of that overgrown forest? And I think it depends on three things. The first is it's a lot of material. So the demand or the requirement for it has to be equally as large. Second, you really want to have to do it, okay? The motivation or the desire has to be almost as large to do it. And then third, the price has to be right. Like, I don't know if you could have sold a rock for $200 or, you know, a rock in 1975. I doubt it, but at $4, apparently you could. So let me give you a thought about how this can happen when you take this material here and torrefy it and give you a big pile that looks like that. If I told you that an organization called the Consortium for Advanced Wood to Energy Solutions actually studied this problem and concluded after 3 years of study that if you took that excess material, torrefied it, and then moved it into a power plant to displace coal, you could actually attach that economic value. And that's exactly what it looks like. That's 5,000 tons of torrefied biomass. And it's a very, very rare picture. How so? How could that work? Well, a coal-fired power plant at 600 megawatts, and that's a medium-sized coal plant, will consume 2 million tons of fuel every year. Some years a little less, some years a little more, but 2 million tons, and it's a medium-sized coal plant. 27% of the power generation in the United States now still relies on taking coal, pulverizing it into a very fine powder, shooting it into a combustion zone, and make electricity from the resulting burn. You want to pulverize that coal because when you shoot it into that combustion zone, you get a very high temperature burn. Okay. Now you want a high temperature burn in the boiler because it makes the overall system efficiency much higher. And what that means when you're making electricity is you're going to get more electrons per unit of fuel that is input on the front end. Now, what that means then, money-wise, obviously, is it's more cost-effective. And that's a good thing, whether you're using coal or torrefied biomass. Now, this fuel is going to be a little more expensive than coal, but I would argue, and it's part of the thesis of this talk, that there are two negative things right now that are happening with overgrown forests. The first is we're getting very unbreathable air spreading over very large areas for people to breathe, and these people actually vote, okay? And the second is these high temperature forest fires are actually causing damage to the forest ecosystem itself. Both of those are the same kinds of undesirable outcomes. That really is no different than finding a lead acid battery just tossed out on the street. Nobody wants to see that. So here is the Boardman coal-fired power plant. This is the place where that 5,000 tons of torrefied biomass was actually test burned. This is the largest test burn of any torrefied biomass material, as far as we can tell, on the planet at this point, and it joined 3 other utilities that have tested much smaller numbers. When the fuel was tested here, it did the 3 things that was absolutely required of it, and this fuel right here. It crushed well, it burned well, and the emissions, as well as the ash, were comparable to coal or even much less. Now, you would have expected that, because one of the benefits of burning wood over coal is it is much less in sulfur, mercury, heavy metals, and salts. What that means when you're actually combusting it is you get a cleaner and you actually get a better burn. Now, lest anybody think that we're going to burn up all of our forests to make electricity, the stuff really will be a little bit more expensive. So if you're a power plant and you're contemplating using it, you'd probably use it during the hottest and the coldest months of the year, where the price of electricity is really quite high, especially lately, and you can offset some of the increased costs of this fuel. There's another mechanism there to account for cost. There are currently 2 torrefaction plants being built in the United States at in the world at commercial scale. One is in Portugal, and the other is in John Day, Oregon. The one in John Day is actually using source material that results from the U.S. Forest Service, under their auspices, removing some of this excess fuel from 2 surrounding or neighboring national forests. So it's actually starting to accomplish some of this task in this thesis. That material is coming into that plant in John Day that's being constructed now, and it has been appropriately labeled restoration fuels in honor of the restoration effort that's being undertaken there. And when it's all said and done, it'll be 100,000 tons of torrefied biomass produced every year. Sounds like a lot of fuel, 100,000 tons, but you recall that medium-sized coal-fired power plant, at full load, 600 megawatts, it would supply that plant for about a week and a half. So you need a lot of fuel to do this. Therefore, you're going to need a lot of torrefaction plants, and that is a given at this point. But the thing to remember is, when you have that level of demand, potentially, it is enough of a market demand. In fact, it's a big market demand, because it's millions of tons of fuel that's used every year. It's a big enough market demand to equate to that very large problem that we have in our forests right now. So it's also a neat idea, because at the end of the day, you can take low-value wood, actually even no-value wood, and this is an example of what's being decked now in John Day. These are small diameter logs and actually diseased trees that are coming from these forests. And they will be chipped and then torrefied into this material here. And I should mention as we go along that, torrefaction is the roasting of wood in a low oxygen environment. Coffee beans are torrefied And just to prove the point, I pulled this off the coffee valet in my hotel today, and it says Rainforest Blend Torrefaction Foncé. I had to Google that to translate it, but I'm not real good with Romance languages, as Carlton mentioned. But that just means it's a dark roast coffee, okay? So coffee is roasted. And you know, we've roasted coffee for, I don't know, on a large scale for a couple hundred years. It's a known process. You roast it in a low oxygen environment, and when you do that, you start a charring process that gives you this dark brown to black colored material. It's colored all the way through, so you know you're successful. It is crushable. It's essentially odorless, and you can store it outside just like coal because it resists reaction with water. It's essentially a hydrophobic. All of this reflects the same characteristics that you see in coal. In fact, you can transport it, handle it, store it outside just like coal. So you're going to take that, turn it into this, torrefied wood, run it into a power plant and make electricity. And the logic flow in reverse does this. The more electricity you make using this torrefied biomass, the more of that we get out of these forests. And by implication, we get a healthier forest, or more ecologically balanced forest. We reduce the propensity for very damaging high temperature and even, as we saw in the last few years, even life-threatening fires. But look, you're going to have forest fires, okay? We're going to have them. But if you're going to have a high-temperature forest fire, you know, we'd prefer to actually have it inside a power plant boiler where it actually does the most good, and you get a 2-for-1 benefit. For those of us in the West who have been subjected to breathing this stuff for literally a couple of years, and I'll tell you right now, in Southern Oregon, Northern California, and parts of Southern California, it looks like that pollution that I just showed you earlier. We'd be grateful if this were to happen for all the reasons that we just recounted. And for those who live in the periphery of these forests, they would breathe a sigh of relief because it would potentially reduce both the number and the intensity of the fires that they'd be subjected to. So, in summary, if you're able to do this, move that fuel, convert it into a torrefied biomass, and then take it in to a power plant to make electricity, and do it at scale, we'd be preserving jobs because those power plants that have a lot of life left in them now will still be operational and preserve the jobs there. It'll create new jobs in terms of this material right here, and it'll take a renewable fuel, which in most states this is considered renewable, in all of Europe for that matter, and displace a fossil coal in that power plant. It can also help revitalize our pretty hard-hit wood products industry that has been recounted here in other talks. In Oregon, that amounts to a 50% decline in that industry, that sector, over the last 30 years. So, join me in wishing this project well. The mill at John Day will be operational by the close of 2019, and should be producing that 100,000 tons sometime out into 2020. If this is successful, I don't doubt there will be many metrics of success you'll be able to hear at talks in the future. You know, I, for one, would not be offended if, say, 5 or 6 years out in the future, somebody came up to me and said, hey, you know, Lei, you were wrong. This actually does have a fragrance. It smells like money. Thanks a lot.